but all right, I think we are good to go. So we're going to do a quick review, not really so much of a review, because usually what I do is I teach one session and then the next session touches on the previous one. So you kind of get a doubling up. In this week, we're kind of going to blow through a bunch of concepts that usually when I teach, if I'm teaching a regular class, of 2-3 days a week, I would split these up. But because we're only meeting once a week and we're only going to do 6 or 7 of these sessions in total, I'm kind of bunching them together. So we're actually going to move a little bit quickly through these concepts. But before we go in, we left off last week with discussing roots. And I'm just curious if anyone has any questions around that concept before we dive into this week. So is there anything that was unclear, or that, a word or something that you've encountered that didn't really fit into what I had shared last week? Because we are going to touch on this week some of the difficulties with identifying a root when one or more of those letters are missing. Okay, so if we're all good, I'm going to share the screen. There we go. Okay. So again, just looking back where we left off last week, we talked about these 3 consonants that make up Hebrew roots. There are almost always 3. Again, we talked about how some primitive words might only have a 2-letter root, but generally Hebrew has these 3-letter roots. Another thing that we touched on, but I just wanted to show you as an example, is that the root letters need to appear in the proper order, okay, in a very specific order. So if you see one word with a 3-letter root and then another word with the same 3 letters, but in a shuffled around order, those are 2 fundamentally different words. So here I just gave you an example using the same 3 letters, the resh, shin, ayin, and here you have, the word rasha, right, which means like bad or evil, and the word ra'ash, which means noise, or it could also be like a earthquake or a weather event that's loud, right? So these 2 words have nothing to do with one another. They share the same 3 letters, but again, because they're in a different order, they mean fundamentally different things. And these are the foundational building blocks of any Hebrew word is its root. And words that share roots are somehow connected in meaning. And last week we talked about how creative some of those answers are, or how creative some of those words get when you build those connections. So the concept of roots is very important, and we are going to touch on that over the next few weeks. We're not going to devote an entire session on roots, but they're going to appear. So now I want to move on to vowels. So before, we talked a lot about the letters and how those sounds are made. So we're going to play a little bit with that, but we're really going to get into the interplay between vowels, which also help navigate. They help build out a root into diverse words, right? So this occurs, by the way, in English, right, where you have words that the consonants are the same, but the way that you play with the vowels changes the meaning. So I think 2 weeks ago or last week, we talked a little bit about the example of the consonants like R, D, right? So you could read, or you could, if you, oh, I'm sorry. I'm riffing on this one, and I think I just confused myself. But yeah, so you could read a book. If you've done it in the past, you've read the book. And then if you, so this concept isn't totally foreign to an English speaker, but it is very pronounced in Hebrew, where what you would do to change the meaning of a word, one of the main things that you would do is play with your vowels. So I just want to touch on vowels because they are really powerful. The letters are the key building blocks of the words. So the letters define the root, but vowels really carry weight within a word in a way that the consonants don't. So vowel sounds, they shift over time and in different accents. So this is something that you might experience with modern Hebrew speakers, is that you can tell the difference between a Sephardic speaker and an Ashkenazic speaker based on some of the vowel sounds. This is true also over the course of history. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of those shifts, but it's just a good thing to know that vowel sounds are very, very fluid in a person's mouth, right? So we have different ways of conceptualizing how a vowel sound is made in your mouth, and they're worth just touching because we're going to group vowels based on where they're placed in the mouth. So you have some vowel sounds that are very open, your mouth is very open, and some where your mouth is very closed, right? So try the ah vowel, right? Ah, mouth is very, very open. If you try the E vowel, your mouth is closed, right? So this is why when you go to the doctor, they have you stick your tongue out and say ah and not E. If you were to go to the doctor and say E, they really wouldn't get a good look of anything going on in there. But when someone wants to get you to smile for a photo, they have you say cheese and not an ah sound, right? Because in closing your mouth in that way, you're going to show your teeth. You're going to smile. So that's one way that you can conceptualize differences between vowel sounds, is whether your mouth is open or more closed. And also another one, which is a little bit trickier to conceptualize, but you can feel the difference in your mouth, is where your tongue is placed in your mouth. So there are some where your tongue is pushed more forward and others where your tongue is back. So like an oo or an o, your tongue is kind of scrunching up in the back of your mouth. You might be able to feel it better than you could conceptualize it. And again, with that E, your tongue is kind of forward. It's not bunching in the back. So again, just play around with that, with like going from ah, E, O, right? You're sensing those two differences. And the other one that I wanted to highlight is lip rounding, right? So with an O, your lips are rounding. So when I talked about whether your mouth was open or closed, another element of that is whether or not rounding is happening. Now, something that we experience in English, but it doesn't really matter so much in English, but it matters very much in Hebrew, is vowel length. So the difference between and e. Again, a lot of people don't hear the difference of these things, but they're going to play a role in a minute and how vowels change throughout a sound. But that's just something to keep in mind. And the last thing, I think I said this word maybe in our first week, but I didn't really talk about it, the diphthong. This is when a vowel sound moves, the same vowel moves in the mouth, right? So the difference between oi and o or e, oi, your mouth, the vowel is moving throughout your mouth in the same vowel, ow, right? You're closing and rounding as you go from an ah, which is very open, to o, which is more closed, more rounding. So ow, right? So these are just some of the terms that we are going to touch on. So now don't get too overwhelmed. This chart is also not even exhaustive, but I just want to show some of the vowels. We're not really going to use a lot of the words. When I teach just spoken Hebrew, I actually don't even teach the names of the vowels. I just say this is an ah vowel, or this is an o vowel, or an u vowel. But we are going to talk, especially to understand grammar, you really do have to identify these vowels as distinct things. So there are a couple of these that I know you're familiar with, right? So you've got these many ah vowels, and we're going to talk in a bit about the difference between the kamatz, the patach, the chataf patach. Something just to note, all of these symbols were designed by these Tiberian Masoretes, who we talked about in the last couple of sessions. Their notation, right, their vowel sounds, their nikud, is graphically, that tradition has survived, but the sounds that we ascribe to them nowadays are different from what they used to have. And so one of the things that I've done here, that if there's anyone on the call who's like a hardcore biblical Hebrew person, they might be upset with me, is that I'm calling these vowels on this chart, I'm calling these vowels by their more modern Hebrew names and not by the vocalization of the Tiberian system. So for instance, the kamatz, right? In the Tiberian system is actually a kametz. So just a reason that name has shifted over time to a modern Hebrew speaker, it's much easier to teach the name of the vowel if every vowel in the name makes the sound that you want it to produce, right? So kamatz makes an ah sound. It's much easier for a student to internalize that than kametz, where you have an ah and an a vowel in the name. So, oh yes.
Yeah, on that very first ah sound, when I went to Hebrew school, that was an or sound.
I love that you just said that. So this is one of the things that we're going to talk about. So this first, the kamatz, the looks like a little T under the aleph, and the aleph and the vav I'm using as placeholders. Remember, these are the ahoy letters. These are the letters that are consonants but can also be used as vowels. The the kamatz, this first one, the T, in the Tiberian system was an O. Pretty much always an O. But again, over time, that vowel sound morphed, and sometimes it makes an ah sound, and sometimes, if you look at the bottom right here, sometimes it does make an O sound. And so we're going to talk about that shift. That's actually one of the biggest things that I hear people nowadays confuse, is when the kamatz makes an ah sound and when the kamatz makes an O sound. So we're going to talk about that system, but you're right. There are still, if you listen to some old Ashkenazic traditions. So if you listen to, sometimes you might go to a Chabad, or if you were to encounter an ultra-Orthodox person who is from an Ashkenazic background, all of the kamatz might make an O sound. So that's where like Shabbos, right? Shabbos Kodesh, right? You get like the vowel sounds going there. Those ahs are all turning into O's. To a modern kind of Israeli speaker, let's say, the ah either sometimes makes an ah sound or sometimes makes an O, depending on the system we're going to talk about in a moment. And the other one that I highlighted here that's red is the shava. Okay, and the shava either makes, in biblical Hebrew, it either makes an I sound, like bit, or it makes no sound at all. In modern Israeli Hebrew, this almost always makes no sound at all. Right. And this is the shva I actually call not a true vowel. It's kind of more or less a placeholder vowel. So just so that you see these, right, you've got your ahs, your es, a, e, o, u. One of the things that shifted between biblical Hebrew and modern Hebrew is modern Hebrew actually has condensed the number of vowel sounds that you make. So in modern Hebrew, there is no difference between the a and the e, right? So the tsere and the segol both make an e sound. The a, that diphthong, is kind of gone from a modern Hebrew speaker. And similarly, the shava really doesn't make a sound in modern Israeli Hebrew. So now I want to talk about why vowel length is important. And this goes, Jerry, to your point also of when that ah makes an O, which we're actually more familiar with than I think a lot of people realize. So you kind of have three categories of vowels. Sometimes they're called something slightly different, but I like to call them, you've got your ah vowels, you have your e vowels, or your e vowels in the middle, and then you have your o, u vowels. And I think that these are categorized in ways that make sense based on how the sound is being made, produced in your mouth. Again, you can play with these, right? Your ah vowels are very much in the middle of your mouth with an open mouth. The e or e vowel, play around with the difference between an e and an e and an a, right? So just make those sounds and feel you're pushing your tongue forward. Your mouth, right, can close a little bit. So the open closedness kind of flows, but your tongue is forward there. And then these o or u vowels, these have to do with your tongue being kind of scrunched back in your mouth and a rounding of your lips. So the o and the oo. Those are some of the things there. Now, the one vowel, or the one set of vowels down at the bottom here, these ultra short vowels, if you notice, this is a vowel that's kind of a compound vowel, right? So you have the patach just on the bottom left here. You have the patach, but with a shava, right? The two dots. And so we call that the chataf patach. You have the same thing with a segol, right? The three dots, and then you have the shava next to it. So that's a chataf segol. And here on the bottom right, you have the chataf kamatz, and that always makes an O sound. So I just, this bottom quote here on the right, this actually, I think, comes from my bar mitzvah parsha. I think this is from Vayechi. V'hu lechof oniyot, right? So you see the aleph here, the chataf kamatz, that always makes an O. It's a short vowel, and it always makes an O. So the difference, and a lot of people, when we grow up in hearing a certain language, the things that are important, the things that make significance in the meaning of words in our language, those our ears become very accustomed to, right? We can really distinguish between the difference. When we grow up with a language that a certain element of language just isn't that significant, we sometimes can't hear it. So some people really don't hear the difference between a short vowel and a long vowel, the difference between an O and an O. They're like, I don't hear the difference. It sounds all the same to me. This is true when I listen to someone and they start talking about tonal languages. English doesn't really distinguish between tone, so I don't pick up on that. It's just my ear isn't used to it. So if I'm ever saying something, whether it's about a consonant or a vowel, and you're like, I really don't hear the difference between those two, it's really just that our ears haven't been trained for these systems. But there is a difference between this short O, this ultra short O, a short O, which is the one, Jerry, that you're talking about here, and then the longer O. And one of the things that that you'll notice, and again, this chart isn't really exhaustive, but one of the things that you'll notice is that in these long vowels, you get an ahoy letter, right? You get one of those consonants that functions as a vowel. You get one of those added on. So sometimes you'll see, we'll break down words into syllables, and you'll notice, you'll be like, oh, there are a lot of letters here. Why are you saying that that isn't really a letter? This yud is a part of the vowel, right? So we'll talk about why that's important. So this bottom here, just, this word oniot, right? An onia is a ship or a boat. That always makes an O sound. So that one's not so tricky. But what I hope to do throughout this session is to explain in these three examples that I put at the top here, right? Kol ha'olam kulo, why the seemingly a vowel under the kaf makes an O sound. Similar in the phrase ozi, vizimratia, right? The ozi, why does this make an O sound? And also, this is famous from the High Holiday service, Avinu Malkenu, chonenu va'anenu, right? This is an O sound under the chet. And a lot of people, you've said a word for a really long time, and then you finally actually look in the Siddur, or you look in the Chumash and you start reading it, and you're like, oh, I've been saying this wrong this whole time. This is an A vowel. It must make an A sound. Even though I've been trained that it makes an O, it does make an O, and we're going to talk about why. So I've mentioned syllables a couple of times, and so I just want to name them here. Every Hebrew word can be broken down into syllables, and a lot of the words that are short, they're just one syllable, right? So it's okay to have a one-syllable word, but they're all broken down into syllables. Syllables in Hebrew are a little bit different from the way that we think about syllables in English. So I just want to name that word, a syllable, might be a little different from how we were taught as kids with English. Usually with English, I like to liken that more to the concept of a beat, not necessarily a syllable, but in Hebrew, the concept of a syllable is a little specific. So each syllable can only have one true vowel. Okay, so if you see a Hebrew word and you count the true vowels, you'll be able, that's the number of syllables that word has. And consonants get carried along for the ride. So basically, we're going to talk about this, but you have two types of syllables. You have an open syllable and a closed syllable. An open syllable ends in a vowel, and a closed syllable ends in a consonant. And you can have consonants there. Think of the vowel as vowels are very powerful sounds out of your mouth. And so the consonants get, they adhere to the vowels. So you'll see that sometimes you have a string of consonants connected to one vowel, and it looks like a very, very long syllable, but that does happen. So you've got these open syllables. Again, they end in a vowel because a lot of these vowel sounds your mouth is pretty open for, or sound is really powerfully being produced through your mouth. And with a consonant ending it closes the syllable. Okay, so this is a big text. This is 2 verses, the first 2 verses of the Bible. But I just want to see if anyone wants to take a crack at let's look at this first word, which everyone might be familiar with, right? Bereshit. Just somebody unmute yourself and tell me, how many syllables do you think are in this first word?
2.
Well, it sounds like 3, but it's probably
3.
2.
Good, beautiful. So it is 2. Michael, why do you say it sounds like 3?
Because a lot of times I think people say bereshit instead of reshit.
Beautiful. Okay, this is great. I'm loving this. So it is supposed to be pronounced bereshit, but this is the difference between a Hebrew syllable and what we think of as beats in English as a syllable, right? We think like bereshit, but the shva is not a true vowel, right? So in a modern Israeli speaker is probably just going to say breshit, right? But in with real kind of proper biblical Hebrew, if you're reading from the Bible, this indeed would make an I sound, bereshit, but because it's not a true vowel, the shava never counts to break up the syllable. So you see that there are 2 vowels, 2 true vowels here. This aleph, by the way, the ahoy letters, right? Remember the ahoy letters, aleph, hey, vav, yud. If there is no vowel under that letter, it is functioning as a vowel when you break up syllables. Okay, so that's a good thing to be aware of. So this aleph is attached to the vowel of the tsere under the resh. Okay. Oh, Fernie,
Yoni,
question.
I have a question. I'm still on last week. But the root of this word is rosh, resh.
Yeah.
Okay. So that was like, I know Rabbi Swearin has said that to me many, many times, but I didn't get it until you explained it. So thank you.
Oh, good. I'm glad. Yeah, and we're going to, and it's funny that you pick on this word. The way that this word is conjugated lends itself to mistranslation often. So it's actually a very, very tricky word. But I'm glad that you caught that. So yes. So when God began, right? So the beginning, the head, rosh, is the core, the root of that word. So here you have 2 syllables. The next word. Who wants to take a crack? How many syllables there are here?
2.
Good, right? Bara. All right, now, the way that you would split these, I just want to show you. Okay, so I want to show you how I would split these. Usually when you split vowels into syllables, you notate them by, on paper, either drawing a line or putting a space in between, right? So I'm just showing you this first word here, bereshit. Notice the aleph is attached to the tsere, right? To this vowel. It's an ahoy letter that doesn't have a vowel under it, so it's not really functioning as a consonant in terms of breaking up the word into syllables. And so you've got one syllable and the second syllable. So now here's the question. In this first word, which category of syllable is this? Let's do the easy one. The second syllable here, right? Is that open or closed? Remember, open ends in a vowel because you end with an open sound in that sense. Closed ends with a consonant. Consonants close. So is the second syllable open or closed?
Closed.
Good, right? The second one is closed. And the first syllable, this one's tricky, right? Is the first syllable open or closed?
I'd say open.
Good. It looks kind of like it's closed because there's no nikud, there's no vowel signs under that aleph. But remember, the aleph here is attached it functions as a vowel, right? So this is the first syllable is open, the second syllable is closed. The next word, right? Bara, the first syllable, open or closed?
Open.
Open, good. And the second syllable, open or closed?
Open.
Open also, right? Again, we have that aleph there functioning as a vowel. Now, I do want to pause here for just 1 second. I think I have to say something that's really important. Breaking down words into syllables is not my strong suit. Okay, I am not 100% confident that last night that I got every single one of these words right, and I think that's just important to note. I'm pretty confident about most of them, but this is something that I stretch here, and so as I was doing this last night, I really wanted to phone a friend and ask for help, but I think generally I've done a good job here. But I think it's important for me to mention where I know what I know and I know what I don't know. And this is something that in concept I know really well, and in practice I struggle with. But I think this is, so here we have open syllables, we have closed syllables, okay? And in these two verses, we have a few examples of really tricky words that have unique features, and we're going to talk about some of those as we continue. So I want to talk about the connection between vowel length and syllables, right? Answering that question that I used to ask my Hebrew teachers when I was a kid and they never had a good answer for, which is, if two vowels make the same sound, if the and the make the same sound, why does it matter which vowel I place under the letter, right? And again, the natural answer is they don't actually make the same sound, right? So remember, this language was spoken first, written down later. And so there actually is a difference in vowel length. There's actually a difference between an and an but my ears aren't used to hearing that, so they sound the same to me. So here we have, just to share, vowels, they kind of have these personalities, right? They've kind of got like a little bit of an ego, all right? And so the long vowels, these big, powerful vowels, they like being in big, powerful syllables that end with a big, powerful sound, right? So the long vowels are kind of, they're happy in open syllables, and they get really offended in closed syllables, and they'll shrink down into a shorter version of itself if it's closed. So when you look at, I'm going to scroll back up, right? The length of the vowel corresponds to whether or not it's in an open or a closed syllable. I know we're moving fast here, I apologize, but that's just something to note. So long vowels like to be in open syllables, short vowels like to be in closed syllables. This is going to be really important when we talk about that kamatz katan, when that T looking vowel makes an O sound. And the one thing I'll note, I might have buried this slide, but the one thing I'll note is that when we talk about accents, we're going to get to that. And I think, Kathy, last week you asked about trope or cancellation, the ta'amim. That's going to come in when we talk about accenting. The kind of the asterisk on this is that accents appease everyone. So if you have an accented syllable, long vowels, short vowels, they're happy. Anyone's happy with the accent. Again, think of it kind of like an ego thing. Like you're cool if you've got a cool accent mark, you're fine. So here we go. The question was, where in this chart of long and short vowels is the shva? Doesn't exist, right? The shva, like I said before, is not a real vowel. Okay, the shva is not a real vowel. It's silent. It sometimes makes an I sound, but it's really not a strong vowel, so it's not in there. However, it is important to know that there are two types of shva. Okay, there are two types of shva. In modern Hebrew, there's only the one, really. There's only the silent one. But in biblical Hebrew, you have two. You call them the shva nach and the shva na. Okay, the shva nach, like lanuach, means to sleep. So the shva nach sleeps, it is silent. And the shva nach marks the end of a syllable. So I'm going to take a word up on the top right here, right? The word malach. The word malach, which means a messenger or an angel, right, has two shva nachs. It's got a shva at the end of the first syllable, mal, and so that's silent. It marks the end of that syllable. And then you have one under the chaf. Now, you actually don't need a shva under the last letter of a word, right? So you'll see often the last letter of a word, like underneath I had the word kohen, a priest, right? There's no shva under that final nun. Why then do we see over and over and over again, do we see a shva under the chaf sofit? So I intentionally used the word kohen under it as an example. Look at how similar the chaf sofit is from the nun sofit, right? In terms of the way that you draw it, right? It's very, very similar. You just have a longer top line. And so scribes would use the shva nach, this unnecessary shva, and they would use that to help you know that even if the scribe like shortened the chaf and it kind of looks like a nun, you know that it's a chaf sofit because there's a shva under it. So the shva that's under the chaf sofit, or that's within it seemingly, is really not doing anything other than telling you this is a chaf sofit. Don't confuse it for a nun, just in case I like spilled a little too much extra ink on the nun sofit of kohen or too little on the chaf sofit of malach. Okay, so you'll see a lot of words that have a chaf sofit at the end. They'll have the shva under it. It's really the only time that you'll see, or one of the only times that you'll see the shva nach marking the end of a syllable. It's obvious that it's the end of the syllable because it's the end of the word. So that's unnecessary. The second one, and this goes to Michael's point on the bereshit, right, is the shva na. The shva na does make a sound. It makes an I sound, and it's found at the beginning of the syllable. So if you hear people do kiddush, right, you hear people do kiddush, and you'll hear them say like, uvayom ha-shivi'i, right? They're ha-shivi'i, right? It's real big on there. That's because that is a shva na. It's at the beginning of a syllable, and it does make a sound. It makes that I sound. Something to note, ha-shivi'i. What's weird about the vowel under the hey? I've gone through this really quickly, so I'm actually... it's an unfair question for me to ask. So the patach, this vowel, is short, yet the vowel is open. Or the syllable, I apologize. The syllable is open, right? So normally you would not expect a patach, a short vowel, in an open syllable, but there's a secret to this, and it has to do with that sexy, sexy dot that's inside of the shin. We're going to talk about that. I'm going to come back to the word. So remember the word hashvi'i. Notice this dot, this dagesh chazak. She lives inside of this shin. That dot, that one dot, is my favorite thing in all of biblical Hebrew, because it's just, it's telling you that there's a mystery that you need to figure out. So that dot is doing a lot of work there, and it answers why, and we'll get to it at the end, it answers why a patach lives in this open syllable. Okay. So the last thing that we need to be aware of with the shva is that you cannot have two shvas next to each other in the same syllable. Okay, so when you have two shvas in a row, first of all, I'm going to go back one slide, right? The shva nach marks the end of a syllable. And so when you have two shvas next to each other, you know that the first one is marking the end of the previous syllable. So that's a shva nach, makes no sound. And then the next one, right, these shvas help to divide the syllables. And so the next one, the second one, does make a sound. Okay, so I want to just take this as an example. We all know this is like the, I don't know, people say this is the first commandment, right? To be fruitful and multiply. Peru urvu. Okay, the first one is a shva na, right? This makes a sound. Urvu is a shva nach. The second one doesn't make a sound. But last week, we talked about the bump rule, these labials, the bet mem pe, and how a vi, the prefix vi, which means and, turns into u before bet mem pe. And it does that because it's just a hard thing to articulate. But there's another rule where another instance where a shava turns into an u sound, right? Where the v turns into u, and that's shown here in urvu. Remember, the shava cannot be its own syllable because it's not a real vowel. And so you would be forced, if this was a shava, right? Be fruitful and multiply, urvu, and you would be forced to put those in the same syllable, but they can't share the syllable. You can't have two shavas in a row in the same syllable. And so it turns into an u. So that's another time. Those are the two rules for when the v turns into u, is if it's before bet mem pe, that's the bump rule. And the second is if the next letter has a shava under it. There are other ways that we avoid the double shva, but I just want to share that. Okay, so now we get to accenting. Accenting is really important in Hebrew. Remember, a vowel that is long or short is happy in an open or closed syllable if the syllable is accented. So here we have, right, when I'm breaking down Hebrew for someone, right, there are like so many dots and dashes, and it's really, really difficult to break down a word. And so now you'll see that first text that I showed now has extra markings on it. These also are from the Tiberian Masoretes. These are, in English, sometimes we call them trope or cantillation marks. In Hebrew, they're the ta'amim. And basically, this is, what do we know about trope? What do they do? What do we focus on when we teach trope?
A melody or
yeah. Exactly, right? They help you sing, right? And so there are actually three functions of the ta'amim, and I hope I don't insult any of our music people, but for me at least, the least important of these three functions is the musicality of it. So I want to talk about the other two. So it really has three purposes. One is accenting, making sure that you are putting stress on the proper syllable. Accenting and syllables also has to do with how vowels morph from one vowel into another vowel, and also with punctuation, right? So if I go back here, right, you've got kind of like a end of sentence here. Instead of a period, you have what's called a siluk, or a sof pasuk. It's this vertical dot under the aleph, or the vertical line under the aleph. And then the colon here, the sof pasuk, is just kind of like, it's a period essentially, so it has to come at the end of the word, but that doesn't help you. The punctuation of the sof pasuk there doesn't actually tell you which syllable is accented, and so that's what the vertical line under ha'aretz does. It's not ha'aretz, it's not ha'aretz, it's ha'aretz, right? So it's telling you which syllable you accent. You've got that siluk, that vertical line under the aleph. So the sof pasuk, the colon at the end of the word, is just saying this is the end of the sentence and the end of the phrase. And the vertical line is actually the trope mark. That's telling you where you are accenting. It went the wrong way. Okay, so accenting, punctuation, musicality. Now for all of our, I have a hard time explaining accenting to students because they're like, I don't really get what the problem is. If anyone is a Harry Potter fan, if anyone has watched the Harry Potter movies, there's a great scene that is like the best example I've ever seen, which is in Harry Potter, Hermione and Ron are sitting next to each other in class, and they're trying to learn a very basic levitation spell, and Ron cannot get it to work. And Hermione, I'm not going to butcher a bad English accent, but she points out to him that he is accenting the wrong syllable. She says it is not Wingardium Leviosa, it's Wingardium Leviosa, right? And he can't get the spell to work because he is stressing the wrong syllable. Similarly, in Hebrew, the accenting is really, really important. Something to know about Hebrew. And this, whether you're talking about biblical Hebrew or modern Hebrew, this is one of the things that makes Hebrew sound weird. When someone speaks with a really English influenced accent, is that Hebrew always stresses either the final or the second to last, either the ultimate or the penultimate syllable. So we never, in a very, very long word, the primary stress is never in the beginning. In English, we often stress the beginning of a word, in Hebrew, you're often stressing the end of the word. And so that's one of the things that sometimes sounds a little bit off when people speak Hebrew in a non-native accent, is that you can tell that the stress is on the wrong syllable. So that's just something to note. It's either on the last syllable or on the second to last syllable. Okay. So trope marks. Some of them are tricky, and I just want to point them out. For those of you who don't know anything about trope marks, it's okay. For those of you who do, I just want to point this out. Some of the trope marks actually use the same symbol, even though they're different trope. Okay, so for instance, this, how would I describe this? This little, like apostrophe almost, this little notch. Yeah, how would you describe it, Kathy?
Thingy.
Yeah, the little thingy, right? In Hebrew, like a kind of like a apostrophe or like a quotation marks or whatever. I was always taught it's a chupchik, right? Or multiple would be chupchikim, right? So basically the Hebrew for thingy, right? Just a nonsensical thing. So you've got these little symbols at the top. And this one, I'm just going to tell you, is called the kadma. And this one, here we go. Let's go here or here, like layabasha here. This is the same looking mark, but it's placed hanging off of the last letter. That one is a pashta. Okay, so they're different trope marks, different places. The difference here, again, is where it's placed on the word. So here is the tricky word. You have the word hashamayim, hashamayim. You have two marks on the same word. So what's going on there? You have, this is supposed to be a pashta. The pashta needs to be hanging off of the last letter. The problem with the word hashamayim is that the stress is actually on the penultimate syllable. And so you put a second one there to show you that the stress is supposed to be on the first mem, but you have the pashta, you have the mark at the end of the word to tell you to sing it like a pashta, not like a kadma. Notice again, the dot within the shin, not the dot above. Notice the dot within the shin. It's this dagesh chazak that I keep teasing, and we are going to get to it. Okay, so just something to note, we have these accent marks. They have to do with the musicality, they have to do with accenting, and they have to do with punctuation. So these are very useful. For our purposes, we're going to focus on accenting. Okay, we covered this already. Great. Here we go. We've got the kamatz katan. Now we're going to start solving our mysteries. All right, so when the a vowel makes an o sound, okay, we all know this phrase. This is from the book of Genesis. This is in our Kiddush on Shabbat. Vaychulu hashamayim v'ha'aretz v'chol tziva'am. V'chol tziva'am. You have this T vowel. It's supposed to make an A. Why isn't it making an O? Okay. Now we have the same word here. This is also in Genesis. This is when God is creating the vegetation. And you have v'chol, same word, sounds pretty much the same, but here you don't have the kamatz under it. You have the cholam, the dot above. So what's the difference? Okay, I could draw the difference here with the word we talked about, like kol ha'olam. It has to do with what looks like a hyphen. In Hebrew, it's a makaf, but you have this thing. Basically what that does, what that little hyphen does, is it makes sure, it basically steals the accent from v'chol, and it only uses the accent on tziva'am, only, almost like it's one word. Okay, so in Hebrew, if I go back to, where is it? Okay, if I go back, you'll notice every single word has an accent mark. Every word has a trope mark, except for the ones that have that makaf, except for the ones that have the hyphen, right? So like here, L doesn't have a trope mark because the makaf connects it to the next word, and it means that basically you now have a word without an accented syllable. So going back here, v'chol tziva'am, if this was now this is no longer accented. The siluk, the sof pasuk, is only on the word tziva'am. So v'chol is unaccented. So now you have this vowel in a closed syllable. The normal kamatz is a big sound, that ah sound. It's a long vowel. It likes to be in an open, powerful syllable. Now you have it in a closed syllable, and so it shortens itself into an o sound, a short o. So v'chol tziva'am. When you have an accent, the next line, when you have an accent on that word, now the vowel needs to be, if you put an a vowel, if you put that kamatz under that, it would be okay because it's accented. So the big long would be fine on here, and then it would sound like v'chal, which is wrong. And so the marking is an o vowel. Remember, the markings of the vowels came after people were saying these words, okay? After people were saying the words and pronouncing them in a way, the Tiberian Masoretes, they had to create a vocalization system that makes sense. And so that's how the difference is there. So here, if you have a makaf, if you have the connector, if you can get the word chol or v'chol, right? If you can get this word v'chol not to have an accent mark, then it's totally kosher for it to have what looks like a long vowel in a closed syllable because the vowel shortens into an O. So Jerry, to your point before, there used to only be that T vowel used to only make an O sound, but when it was elongated, for whatever reason, it turned into an A, and when it stayed short, it turned into an O. So that's there. So now we have the dagesh chazak, okay? So you have a couple of different dageshim. You have two different dagesh markers. You have the dagesh kal. This, how do I explain the dagesh kal? The dagesh kal is like, I don't know if Meryl Streep has a younger brother, but that's the point, right? Meryl Streep is the dagesh chazak, right? She is who you show up for. She is the one who's got, like, she's powerful. If she has a brother, fine, right? That's the dagesh kal. The dagesh kal only exists in these beged kefet letters, the letters that can either be flowing or stopped sounds, right? So the bet and the vet. There you have a dagesh kal. It doesn't change the meaning of a word. It doesn't tell you anything cool. It's just there. The dagesh kal, it's a simple dagesh. It's just a dot that tells you the difference between a bet and a vet, or a kaf and a chaf. It is not interesting. It is the unknown sibling of the really famous person. But then you have the dagesh chazak. And the dagesh chazak tells us a lot. The dagesh chazak is powerful. The dagesh chazak is mysterious. She reminds me of Carmen Sandiego. Okay, and I'll explain why in a second. But she's just like, she's mysterious, she's powerful, and she steals, but she leaves a little clue for you to figure out. So the dagesh chazak, I'm always into the dagesh chazak. The reason that I mentioned someone like Meryl Streep is that sometimes you get a dagesh chazak in one of these letters. How many of us are not oldest or favorite siblings, right? So some of us have cooler, more powerful siblings, and when they show up, they take your place. So if you ever see a dagesh chazak, or if there should be a dagesh chazak in a beged kefet letter in one of these letters, it turns into a dagesh chazak. So she steals the show. So here we go. Let's talk about what powers the dagesh chazak has. We're just going to touch on a few of them, and then we'll continue next week. So one is it hides these liquid letters, okay? And one of the most famous liquid letters, and this is true in English too, is the nun, okay? The nun. The word min means from, okay? You'd stick it behind something. So min haaretz is from the earth, min ha'adama, from the land, from. Sometimes you see this prefix, it turns into a prefix, it loses the nun. The nun disappears, but it dissolves. I like the concept of a liquid letter, because think of it like a salt water, okay? It evaporates, but a little bit of residue is left. That is marked by the dagesh chazak. So I want to show you an example. Okay, here are some phrases that you might know. If you notice, mi mizrach mizrach, this first red one here. Okay. Well, what direction is mizrach? I'll give you a hint. The root of this word is zerach, which means to rise, to sprout, yeah. So it's a direction. It has to do with the sun. If the root of mizrach is like to rise and shine, what direction is mizrach?
East.
Good. So this means from the east. Instead of min mizrach, we just see mi prefix, and there's a dot in the mem. Now you know that this is a dagesh chazak because it can't be a dagesh kal. Dagesh kal only appears in those beged kefet letters, right? So the mem, we know there's no mem and then other variation of the mem. It's not like bet, vet. And so this has to be a dagesh chazak. So what is this dot doing in there? It's hiding, it's hinting to that lost nun. Same thing from mim arav, from the west. You have in the second letter, in the second mem, you have the dagesh chazak. Same thing here, right? Adonai mis Sinai ba, okay? From what's Sinai?
Sinai?
Sinai.
Exactly, right? So God comes from the Sinai. So mis Sinai, it would be min Sinai, but when you say that really quickly, the nun is a weak letter. It's a liquid letter. It evaporates, it disappears, and you just get Sinai with a dot. The dagesh chazak is telling you that once upon a time there was a nun sound in there. This happens in English. In English, the prefix in should reverse the meaning of a word, right? So if something is if I can't get out of it, right, it becomes inescapable, right? Inescapable, right? We use, all of these, I'm bad at thinking on my feet right now, but if you can't separate two people, they're inseparable, right? So it reverses the meaning of a word. The N sound is a very weak liquid sound, and sometimes it disappears when you say a word over and over and over again. So for instance, if something is not legal, it becomes illegal, right? The prefix should be in, but before the L, it just doubles up the L, right? So try saying illegal 100 times fast, right? Illegal, 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 illegal. It just turns into illegal, right? Hold on, I left on the whiteboard. I knew I wasn't going to be able to think on my feet, so I wrote them down beforehand. If something is not legitimate, right? Illegitimate, illegitimate, right? You double up on the L. This also happens in English where it turns into, right? In English, we have a bump rule too, the BMP. In turns into im. So if I'm not patient, right? So bump, right? Patient starts with a P. So impatient, not impatient.
Would immoral be also an example of that?
Yes, exactly. Exactly that, right? So bump, right? So that one's with the M in bump, right? So impatient was with the P. Immoral, immoral. You double up on the M sound. So immoral. Right. And same thing, if you can't resist something, it's not irresistible, it's irresistible. You have a double R there. So in biblical Hebrew, when you have the dagesh chazak, you're basically hiding that previous letter. You're doubling up now on the samech sound. And so when you read Torah, and some it's called a tikkun. It's like a chumash, but with very, very precise markings to help you read Torah accurately. Sometimes you'll see that this samech is bolded, right? Or that the dagesh within it is bolded so that you know it's a dagesh chazak. And so you kind of emphasize that sound a little bit more. So instead of like Sinai, it's Sinai, right? Just emphasize it a little. It's not really a doubling. It's not quite a stutter, but there's a bit of a hold there. So Mimizrach is really Mimizrach, if you were to read it. It's a subtle difference, but it's just a stronger note there, and it hides that nun that is gone. When you break up the word into syllables, you can kind of do it in your head with putting that letter back, right? So Misinai, right, is kind of like that nun with the shava, right, kind of exists at the end of that first. It breaks up that first syllable. Okay, this is going to become important in a moment. So this is just something to keep in mind. Here we go. Now, the next one that we're going to talk about, another liquid letter, another weak letter that gets hidden, is the lamed. So everybody who's learned Hebrew knows that ha means the, okay? Ha sefer, the book, right? Archaically, the word the was hal, hal. But the lamed disappeared. The lamed got lost because it's just a letter that would get confused in your mouth. And so again, when we have the word the, or the prefix the in a Hebrew word, you'll see a ha and then a dagesh chazak in the next letter. So here we go. We got hashamayim back. Beautiful, right? So bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim. You have this dagesh chazak in the shin, within the shin. I'm not talking about the point at the top of the shin. Within the shin, you have a dagesh chazak, hashamayim. Okay, same thing here, and that's the heavens, right? And here you have the word hamayim at the end of the next one, and again, that's the waters, right? So, and Ruach Elohim, right? The spirit or the wind of God is hovering over the face of the waters, right? On top of the waters, hamayim. You have the dagesh chazak within the mem, and again, you know it's a dagesh chazak because it can't possibly be a dagesh kal, because the kal only exists in the bet, gimel, daled, kaf, pei, tav. Now, we have the question before of why then, right, is the vowel under the hey in hashvi'i, why is that a short vowel? The patach, that a vowel with just a straight line, is a short vowel. How can that be in its own syllable? And it's because it used to actually have a lamed after it, right? It was halshvi, 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 hashvi, 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 right? The lamed disappears. It gets left with the residue of the little Carmen Sandiego note telling you that she stole the lamed is in the shin. It's left there for you to discover the mystery. And so ha shivi'i, right? Now this shiva is not notating the end of the ha syllable. It actually begins the next syllable. It only makes sense in breaking up the words, the shiva that you speak, right? The shiva na, that is I and not silent. It only makes sense if you understand how hal turned into ha and why the dagesh chazak is in the shin. So you have hashvi'i, gets broken up into syllables in your head. You don't actually put the lamed back, but in your head, I'm just doing this for illustrative purposes. You put the lamed there, that shiva at the under the lamed ends the ha syllable, and then shivi is the second syllable, and I is the last syllable. So hashivi'i is how that works. And again, you have that beautiful dagesh chazak in there that's just like tickling your brain, trying to ask you to figure it out. So I think this is the last one that we're going to do, just because we're basically at time here, is now we get into the trick, and we're going to talk about this next week. Sometimes it's difficult to determine the root when there's a missing letter. Okay, so the root, chet, nun, nun, right? Some of you might have met an Israeli with the name Hanan, right? So it means to show favor, to be gracious to. In the, let's look at the first line here. This is from that priestly blessing. Ya'er Adonai panav elecha vichuneka. Okay, so the V, right, is a prefix. The ka at the end means you, right, to you. And so you only have two letters here. And so people, it can be troubling to figure out what the root of this word is when there's kind of only two letters. But what do we see? There's something that's odd. What do we see? We see the dagesh chazak in the nun, right? There can't be a dagesh kal in the nun. So the dagesh chazak is hiding the second nun that would be in there. It's just a hard thing to say, right? Vichunencha, right? So you don't do that. So it's vichuneka. Okay, vichuneka. Now, this becomes important, right? So we see, all right, at the bottom here, I just put the name like Hanania is God shows favor, right? Yah is the suffix there. It means God. It's a name of God. So Hanania means God shows favor. Hanan is, favorable. And here we go, the last mystery that I mentioned at the top, which is the word chonenu. Okay, people get this wrong when they read the High Holiday, when they pray the High Holiday service and they sing Avinu Malkeinu. And sometimes you hear someone goes Chanenu. So it shouldn't be Chanenu, it should be Chonenu. The problem is a lot of people who are praying out of the Siddur for the first time on the High Holidays, they know this vowel as an A vowel, and so they don't know it makes an O, but now we know why it makes an O. So if we put everything together, everything that we know about long and short vowels and open and closed syllables and accents and all of these things, this nun here, this second nun in chonenu, that nu is a suffix, right, to us, like anachnu is the word for we. So nu, this one is not a part of the root. Instead, the dagesh chazak in the first nun shows you that it's hiding. It's hiding that second nun. And so the way that you would break this up into syllables is actually a 3-syllable word. You have 1, 2, 3 with this first nun hidden in the dagesh, right? So here, remember, in Hebrew, you can only have an accent on either the last syllable or the second to last syllable. So it is off limits, totally off limits for this first syllable of 3 to be accented. So it can't preserve a long sound. It has to shorten into an O. So this word is pronounced chonenu because when you break it up into its syllables, then you recognize that the accent is here and the penultimate. You know that it makes an O sound because, again, that A vowel, when it's in a closed syllable that is unaccented, it makes an O sound. Okay, we'll come back to this next week because I think we're pushing it. But this explains same thing here, right? That we all know from Havdalah and from the Song of the Sea, right? The phrase Ozi v'zimratia, same thing here. This vowel makes an O sound because there's a dagesh chazak in the zayin, which is hiding the second zayin from the root, which means strong. And so again, when you break it up, it turns into Oz Z. Right. So if you were to read Torah and you were to pronounce this word, it's a subtle difference, but instead of just oz, it's oz, right? You hold the zayin a little bit because again, it's hiding that second zayin. So we'll pick this up again next week. We're going to talk more about these roots. Another thing that we're going to talk about next week, because I got a question the other day about this, is I'm going to show you how understanding the roots, the prefixes, the missing letters that are hidden in the dagesh and all of that really, really helps you look up words in Hebrew dictionaries on your own, because many good Hebrew dictionaries, some of the best Hebrew dictionaries, especially biblical and rabbinic Hebrew dictionaries, it's so much easier to structure them based on a root and then to go into all of the meanings that you could get out of a single root. It just means you have, fewer pages in your dictionary. It's easier to find something. And so that will help for anyone who wants to translate prayers or Bible stuff on their own. We're going to talk about how that's useful. And then we'll talk about some of the unique features of Hebrew and some of the shifts from biblical Hebrew to modern Hebrew. So are there any questions before that was a lot. I know we packed in a ton, but I just, I felt like it would be useful to get them all together. Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, just like what Robin said, can you send us the slides?
Absolutely.
I guess we could print them up, make a book out of them, and you could charge for it.
Yeah, I should really, if I was better, at the bottom of each of these slides, I would cite the places where I get a lot of this stuff from. So, some of these examples are straight out of biblical grammars. because I'm such a fun person. Those are the books that I read in my free time. Some of them come from lectures and things that I've sat in. And so, I'll say none of the ideas that I share are my own. So that's the only reason why I'm hesitant. I really should be noting these things. But, I will share again, YouTube has great resources. I know I've heard that some of you really enjoyed when I emailed out links to Eric Singer's, Eric with a K. He's a dialect coach for Hollywood actors, and he does a lot of really fun videos for Wired magazine, breaking down different accents, and he goes into how different sounds are produced in the mouth and how they change over time and place. Jeffrey Kahn has done some of the best and clearest work that I found on reconstructing the Tiberian system. Edward Horowitz wrote a very, very fun book talking about the evolution of Hebrew. It's called How the Hebrew Language Grew, I think it's called. And then, there are kind of the big famous grammars that were written in like the late 1800s. And then there are some updated ones. And then I'd say the last thing that's useful is Mark Tzvi Bretler wrote a textbook basically for biblical Hebrew, about biblical Hebrew for modern Hebrew speakers, which really helps give examples and shows very clearly the differences between biblical and modern Hebrew. So, I'm just, that's my like cheating way of showing my sources without actually writing them down. But there are really great resources online. There are really good books. Nothing in my head is proprietary or is mine. So that's the only thing that I hesitate with the slides and things, is I don't want anyone to think that I've figured anything out. It all has been either taught to me or discovered by staying up way too late watching YouTube. Are there any other questions on some of the things that we talked about? Syllables, accents, vowels. We'll touch a little bit more about it next week. And again, the concept of roots are going to keep playing a very important role in understanding Hebrew. When we talk about prefixes and suffixes, and then when we talk about verb constructs, it's all going to show how a very, very simple 3-letter root can mean a whole variety of, or you can convert that into meaning almost anything. And so it's a really powerful way of learning Hebrew and of being able to break things down. So I hope you're still having fun. We're really getting into the weeds now. So, so long as you're having fun, I'm having fun.
Very much so.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. Well, have a Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
Shabbat shalom.
And we'll see you next week.
Thank you,
Shabbat shalom.
Yoni, so much.
Yeah.